Hello, I'm Andre J, and today we are going to talk about creative work as private property. So, what did everybody think of that intro song that we just heard? Who do you think deserves credit and deserves some sort of reward for that creative artwork? And in the absurdly unlikely situation where someone was to offer payment for the solo exhibition of such a thing, who deserves to get paid in some sort of hot currency dollar money thing? I'm pretty sure everyone listening to this has some sort of gut feeling on what is the right answer to these questions. And what I'd like to do is spend most of this talk discussing these common gut reactions that folks in the art community usually have to these questions. Take these reactions into some possibly logical conclusions, and then wrap some things up with potentially unintuitive remarks. So, starting off, who deserves credit and who deserves to get paid? This seems like pretty cut and dry when we're talking about creative artwork. If we can acknowledge that someone has done a sufficient amount of creative work, then clearly they deserve to both get some kind of credit in the forms of written by, performed by so-and-so, XYZ, and they deserve to get paid. They deserve to receive some sort of monetary, money ticket thing, which they can then use to, sustain their life in some form, one way or the other. So, seems pretty cut and dry, but I would like to probably go and muddy these waters up a bit. So, I'm going to start off by talking mainly about remixing and sampling, and how we view remixing and sampling in creative works. I'm going to use as an example, just to talk about something else first that I didn't create, by the album My Life in the Bush of Ghosts by David Byrne, credited to David Byrne and Brian Eno. The reason I'm choosing this one is because I personally I think it's a fairly mediocre album. Not really remarkably great, not really remarkably terrible. It's not really critically, massively critically acclaimed. It's not really massively critically reviled. It's fairly obscure-ish in the grand scheme of things. It was created by people who David Byrne and Brian Eno would probably consider themselves, and I think a lot of people in the world of popular music appreciation would consider these people to be slightly more on the arty artist spectrum of versus a mass media entertainer. But this album, they both fundamentally do work in mass media. This album was created as a mass media consumer project. It was sold as a mass media consumer product, so this album has a pretty nice intersection of a lot of the things we'd like to talk about. And what is this album? If you've never heard it, and most people probably have not, it's not, like I said, not super popular, not really a terribly groundbreaking work or anything. It's mostly instrumental jams by Brian Eno, Byrne, and a bunch of their usual friends. On the thing that kind of made it stand out at the time was that there was nobody sang on anything. None of the credited musicians sang on anything. They used samples and loops of vocals from other songs, from tape sources, and from radio shows, televangelists, exorcisms. It is claimed by some critics to be influential to both hip-hop and sample loop-based electronic music of the 90s. I would exercise a very significant amount of caution in jumping to this conclusion, not least because Eno and Byrne are both more artists who work in the lines of finding an edgy trend, jumping on it, riding it, turning it into something which is fairly palatable to a middle-class avant-garde audience, and not really the most radical groundbreakers in themselves. And also, like I said, this is a fairly obscure album. There's not massive. There was no massive popular movement that sprang up as a result of this album. It would be hard to really trace any sort of massive lineage of sampling and looping as a direct result of this album. So yeah. It's also just old enough, and there's just like so many credited complaints and legal things that came up about this album that it really works as a great example to sort of pick apart a lot of the standard complaints that everyone seems to have about remixing and sampling artwork in general. So let's talk about the complaints. One of the vocal samples used, actually several of the vocal samples used in different tracks, was by a Lebanese singer named Dunay Yunus. So in order to get the rights for these samples, Eno and Byrne used their management and their record company, like legal business, to clear the samples through the major label that issued these albums that the samples came from. So they went through the full legal framework of getting lawyers involved and paying money, and they got the rights. They got what seemed to them to be totally valid rights to use these samples in the context that they wanted to put them in. Of course, 30 years later, when the album got reissued, the singer found out that their samples were being used in this album, and then they went and personally sued Eno and Byrne for using their vocals, and apparently settled out of court, probably got paid something. So we have this sort of mildly tangled issue already of, from a legal standpoint, it was perfectly valid for them to use these samples, but then is it actually the right thing to do if you just pay a record label? Does the record label actually own all of the rights to the creative work that it puts out? From a legal standpoint, one legal standpoint, yes, it's perfectly valid, and from another legal standpoint, it's perfectly invalid. The singer also needs to be personally involved. So the possibly we have this situation where the record label that put out the Lebanese singer's artwork did not do due diligence and reward the singer for their stuff. I don't really want to get too far into that rat hole because that's an entirely different conversation. But yeah, so we have two little wormholes already. You can pay money and throw lawyers at the problem, and that seems to make it okay in some social ways, but then you have to also take into consideration another level of personal responsibility, not just the legal responsibility, and then that personal responsibility can then take it back into a legal responsibility, and yeah, we've already got a little bit of messiness here. The Rolling Stone magazine review, here's a quote from the Rolling Stone magazine review for this album. Like most found art, it raises stubborn questions about context, manipulation, and cultural imperialism. ... Does this global village have two-way traffic? So we have the claim that what Eno and Byrne are doing here is cultural imperialism, which is probably a lot more triggered by the inclusion of North African and Middle Eastern artists and speakers in these samples, as opposed to in most of the other samples used. These would be samples from American Christians, people on talk radio shows, people doing exorcisms, people doing evangelizing. So I this is contrafactual, but if the samples had been primarily of American Christians, do you think that the Rolling Stone would have made this same kind of argument? On the other hand, David Byrne is from Scotland by the way of Canada. Brian Eno is English. So from another standpoint, it's perfectly valid to call them out for appropriation of American religious culture. They don't really have any direct relation to this. They are aliens to American religious culture. But we feel that there is some sort of fundamental difference between English people or people from the British the British Isles and their relation to American culture, and the relation of people from the British Isles to North Africa and the Middle East. And this has a lot to do with the history of not just cultural but actual military imperialism, which still colors today the cultural interactions of people from all parts of the world. Yeah, and then the cultural imperialism claim can also not just refer to the samples, but the genre of the performed studio music in the background of everything. A lot of it is sort of this like what was trendy at the time was to take this sort of Central African drum and bass rhythms, a little bit of funky guitar stuff, and meld them with kind of pretty bland, new wave, rocky, funky kind of stuff. So we have another issue of credit where we're not just talking about straight up sampling, we're talking about cultural sampling. Is it morally right for one culture, especially a culture which has a heritage of colonizing, to appropriate the music of those who descended from colonizers? So we get into this sort of cultural essentialism argument here as well. So, and the argument is not just that you are sampling things, but you are taking an influence, you're taking the genre of music that doesn't come from your personal direct interactional culture and something else, and appropriating that and putting it in a different light. So this is another complaint. Another issue with this album. So there was originally a song called "The Quran," where the vocal track was taken from a tape recording of Algerians chanting verses from the Quran. An organization called the Islamic Council of Great Britain asked them very firmly and strongly to remove this from the album. And let's be very clear to note here, the Islamic Council of Great Britain was not upset that Eno and Byrne were using a tape recording of Algerians speaking without the Algerians' position. As far as I can tell, neither the Islamic Council of Great Britain nor Eno or Byrne had any direct interaction with the people whose voices were actually being used on the tape. The Islamic Council was upset that anyone was daring to use samples of people chanting the Quran for some form of mass media entertainment. And then we can kind of contrast this with the response that people have to the fact that they appropriated significant amounts of American Christian evangelizing. There was a song called "The Jezebel Spirit" on the original album with the preacher Catherine Kuhlman, which they also couldn't end up getting the rights to, but they were able to just grab another anonymous Christian exorcism track to use instead of that. So they still kind of got to have the flavor of some sort of fiery Christian evangelical speaking, but just with someone who didn't have any sort of legal representation whatsoever. So then we have the concept that no one from a Christian culture should be able to appropriate anything from an Islamic culture. Not anything from an Islamic culture. That anyone from a Christian culture should not be able to touch or interact with the information of the Quran in any way, because this is massively disrespectful, while simultaneously holding that it's pretty okay for them to appropriate and use information and stuff from a Christian culture. So there's sort of a standard liberal reactionary sense that says basically there's no we have to sort of leave alone the religious traditions of other cultures while simultaneously being highly skeptical and interrogative towards our own Christian culture. In some ways, this has felt like a different form of cultural condescension and Orientalism and exoticism. Not quite sure what a great response to it is, but I think it's just worth mentioning that this is kind of a tangled ground, and it feels like there is some amount of Orientalism coming into play here from the Westerners' sides of things. Okay, And then one more complaint that someone had about this album. So, the avant-garde musician and composer John Hassel, they were originally invited to be a part of this album. To like, it was supposed to be Eno, Byrne, and Hassel all working together as equals on this album. But Hassel was poor; they couldn't even afford a plane ticket out to California to work on things. And then when Hassel heard the tape of this album, they said, here's a direct quote, "I was outraged. This was clearly a not too subtle appropriation of what I was doing over some rock, drums, and bass, and I thought it was a very unethical thing to do, and the fact that I was never credited, even for being an inspiration, is a testament to the testosterone in the room at the time." So, what Hassel was upset about is that Eno and Byrne used the idea of sampling and looping, which they felt was their thing, their idea, their musical idea, and then did not get credited for inspiring their idea on this album. So here's another thing that someone can get upset about, is just that it was their technique. It was like when someone has a very specific glitch art technique and they use it all the time and they're like, this is my thing. But the problem is that a lot of glitch art techniques like this, sampling and looping, are like obvious things that anyone can try and do, and then someone else tries it and your friends do it, and even though it seems like your friends are doing it and they're having a good time, you're like, I'm pissed because you didn't say you got the idea from me. So there's this idea that maybe Eno and Byrne should have credited John Hassel for giving them the idea. This, I think, is it's worth digging into a lot because this basically doesn't really happen. And it's questionable as to, like, is this, like, actually, like, a thing that artists are required to do? Is an artist 100% of the time required to provide a full disclosure of where they got all of their ideas from? Maybe this is a good idea. Maybe it's completely insane. But, yeah, just another valid complaint that someone felt they had about this album. Appropriation of the basic concept of sampling and looping other people's artwork. And then finally, the title, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts. This was taken from a book by the Nigerian author Amos Tutuola. Neither of Eno or Byrne had ever read the book. They thought the title was just like summed up their ideas quite well, and people have leveled claims that this was basically just like a form of basically like exoticism. Just this idea that like, okay, these two white middle class dudes are just going to sort of like take like little bits of like some exotic spice and throw it on their kind of bland, like, new wave art rock, and then be like, oh, we're kind of transporting you into this exotic, mystical other land. And this is sort of the complaint that they're not truly engaging with the artwork in question. Like, this is sort of going one step beyond, like, the cultural appropriation accusation and saying, well, you're not even, like, bothering to, like, engage with what you're taking. You're just sort of grabbing the surfaces of things and you're putting them on something else and you're sort of personally profiting from that. So this is kind of like more of the deeper academic notion of cultural appropriation, which is a slightly different argument than what is often made in like popular mass media. So let's turn the conversation over to my remix of the two songs that I used for this. The one song was "You Stole My Heart," credited to the boy band One Direction, and "You've Stolen My Heart," credited to Asha Bosley and the Kronos Quartet. So before we go any farther, let me just make it clear, I only used these two samples from these two songs in order to make the song at the beginning of this. I did zero instrumental work. I only processed the music from these two songs, did a little chopping up, spliced them, processed them, put them back together in a different way. So zero instrumental work from me. You can make the case that I composed nothing and I simply completely rearranged existing, creative work. And let's talk about ownership and credit with regards to how this song was constructed. Let's start off with One Direction. So who is One Direction? One Direction was a prefab band created by Simon Cowell, originally just to compete on a reality show about making like teen pop star bands. So potentially we've already got a couple more people that we should be crediting other than One Direction. We can say that this band would not exist without Simon Cowell and also the producers and creators of the reality show in which they competed on, because otherwise the song and none of One Direction would probably exist. If you look up who wrote the actual song, Stole My Heart, this is credited as written by Jamie Scott and Paul Meehan. These are not members of One Direction. And it should also be noted that none of the credited members of One Direction played any of the instruments on this song, nor did they contribute to the production process, and is also quite clear there's a significant amount of pitch correction on the track, which means that another instrumentalist had to collaborate with the recorded voices that they had in order to create the final vocal melodies. So we have One Direction is credited for the song, but they did not write the song. They had a very low impact on starting the band themselves. They performed none of the instruments, and they did not do any of the production on the song. But they are still credited for the song. I wasn't really able to scratch up any details on who did any of the production and instrumental work. So is it fair to say these people don't deserve any credit? I'm fairly certain they probably got paid for their work. So who does get the credit here? Do we just credit every single individual? We can't even dig up the information on who played those, like, that totally, like, ripping, like, super saw synth lead on this. So we're sort of stymied by trying to actually credit everyone involved with this. And also, if you just play this song to people on the street, if someone recognizes it, they'll say, this is One Direction. They're not going to say Jamie Scott and Paul Meehan, Simon Cowell, the creators of Project X or whatever the show was. They'll just say it was One Direction. And also, I just want to say here, just as a side thing, let's be clear, I'm not in any way trying to say that prefab youth culture song and dance acts don't do incredibly hard work. It's a massive amount of work to be in this sort of a band, because not just because you have to maintain a general level of attraction and be able to sing and dance extremely well and extremely consistently again and again, over and over, but you also have to be performing basically constantly. Your entire life becomes a performance during the time that you are popular, because every single one of your interactions with paparazzi, media, everything else has to reflect positively on this band. So you are doing an insane amount of work, basically like transforming your life into a constant performance in order to be some kind of a teen idol. So this sort of work, this is very hard work. Like, we should appreciate the kind of work that these people do. This is not to like denigrate like teen idol bands. Like, great job. The other song I used samples from was called "You've Stolen My Heart." That's the English language translation. It's credited to Asha Bosley, the famous playback singer, and the American avant-garde strings group Kronos Quartet, who performed most of the instrumentation on the version of the song that I used. This is not the original version of the song. The original version of the song is from a Bollywood soundtrack. And neither of these performers, Asha Bosley or Kronos Quartet, wrote the song whatsoever. This was clearly credited to the legendary composer R.D. Burman. And R.D. Burman, of course, well known for their revolutionizing Bollywood music by infusing Bengali folk music traditions with Western pop and rock, jazz and disco, Mediterranean music, Latin music, Arabic music, Central Asian music, Not only were they sort of highly influenced by a large variety of like popular and folk music traditions, they would regularly just straight up steal the lead melodies of like Western popular music songs. Primarily because the directors of a movie that they were hired to compose for would say, "Hey, check out this popular song. This is really great. Can you just fucking lift this melody and use that for like the hit song from this album?" Let's see. R.D. Berman's compositional technique would involve just a truly massive number of musicians. You try to look things up, and you can find a page that lists like 50 different musicians who are like, these were sort of the common ones that they would work with pretty regularly. So vast number of musicians that we worked with in their composition, and there's really no way to know for sure what kind of influence back and forth R.D. Berman and their studio musicians had in terms of their composition. They didn't write the lyrics to the song. R.D. Berman did not write lyrics. Those were written by Majru Sultanpuri. And of course, the lyrics and the melody of this particular song, "You've Stolen My Heart," were, you can say, strongly inspired, you could say directly ripped off from the song "If It's Tuesday, This Must Be Belgium," which was performed on the album, an album by an ethnic Bulgarian but nationally Dutch singer, Bojura. And the music to that song was also written by the Scottish folk singer Donovan. So, who do we give the credit to here? I mean, it seems like a very simple thing to say, that we can just like look at who's credited on the album and say, this is their original artwork, and I am taking this artwork. But doing any amount of research into how the creative process works immediately starts to tangle up these ideas that you can own a creative property. Let's not even stop there, though, because it's also totally valid to accuse me of cultural appropriation in using music from Bollywood soundtracks in my personal artwork. I am ethnically a farm boy from northern Wisconsin in the United States of America. I have no racial, ethnic, nationality, anything to do with any Hindi-speaking folks from North India. And the one of the most prominent arguments that people make when they're talking about mass media cultural appropriation is that not even my individual deep abiding love and respect for music from the golden age of Bollywood, the deep and abiding love that has gone on for about 20 years plus at this point now, love and respect which involves me both learning as much about the context of the music as well as teaching myself how to play many of the songs and various instruments, can overcome the fact that I am clearly, obviously, if you just look at me, I'm from the essential racial stock of colonizers. R.D. Berman, Asha Bhosle, and everyone else involved in the production of Bollywood music are from the essentially racial stock of colonized. And this colors any cultural interaction that I can have with them. And so it kind of has to be, the only possible interaction can be of me just shallowly exploiting their artwork for my profit, even though the profit in this case would be purely aesthetic. So, and there's no need to bring into the sort of kind of like seems to like directly contradict everything I said in the last section where I was talking about how did R.D. Berman compose this kind of music. He clearly viewed pretty much all music from anywhere in the world as fair game to be influences or just directly ripping off like riffs from it. But we kind of have to deal with the fact that this specific argument of cultural appropriation, which is not the only argument of cultural appropriation, just one very specific one that is used in mass media context, it has a tendency to lead to a worldview which kind of fundamentally reinforces the sort of virulent colonial and racialism that dominated thought patterns and power structures in the 19th and early 20th century. And we do also have to deal with the fact that when we use these as arguments, we are sort of implicitly reinforcing these ideas. And then if we actually look at how artists, the creative individuals that like make the music that we are actually interested in, we have to look and see that their actions, their lives, their creative outworks seem to basically like belie this kind of this view of the world. So where do we go from here? My goal up until now was to take these various threads of credit, ownership, deserving, owing, property, and then just kind of keep pulling at them until shit starts to unravel. My point was to show if we take these basic assumptions we have and try to get to some kind of logical conclusion, we can only get more and more tangled up. In cultural studies and critical theory, the traditional way to come at these kind of things from an academic standpoint, the conclusion we have if we get to situations like this is usually to either embrace and mystify the confusion by just like throwing significant amounts of academic doublespeak on top of things, or to just say, hey now, stop everything, let's turn our assumptions into hardline moral axioms, and then we don't have to be concerned about any sort of gray area or like internal contradictions. So I don't come from these kind of backgrounds, though. I come from a scientific and mathematical academic background. In math and physics, if you start with a set of assumptions, you do logical reasoning and or empirical measurements and come to contradictory and logically inconsistent results, your only reasonable conclusion is that some, if not all, of our assumptions that we're making are incorrect. So let's take a step back and look at what assumptions are we making here. There's two basic assumptions I can think of that really kind of drill down to the nitty-gritty of this. One, we are assuming that the results of creative work can be treated like private property. And not just any private property, but the very specific idea of private property that we have in Western legal states. And number two, we are assuming that anyone doing creative work deserves both credit and to be paid money for their efforts. So I'm just going to flat out say that I think these are kind of bullshit assumptions to make. Like, let me go into some details about that. To work with one, all creative work is a collaboration, both directly with other individuals and indirectly with the infinite array of shifting cultures we are in constant communication with. There is no such thing as a totally lone individual that just invents some sort of creative work out of nowhere. There is no such thing as a completely lone individual influenced by no one. This doesn't exist. Has never existed ever. If we try to meld the way that creativity works through individuals and cultures with this Western tradition of private property as the ultimate bedrock of society, we are only going to do harm to how people do creative work in general. The Western ideal, and let's go specifically on private property for a second here, the Western ideal of private property is rooted in this kind of quirky and unique Roman legal tradition, and the important thing to note about the Roman legal tradition of private property, that it was itself already twisted into these very nasty logical knots by the attempt of Roman elites to provide legal apparatus for enforcing both slavery and all of the other various forms of violent coercion of the powerless and fear into the economic exploitation that basically kept the empire running. There's not really any good way that I can personally see to use a legal system based on violent coercion of the poor by the powerful to justify private property as being a useful idea, as a useful basis for any kind of a reasonable society, let alone as the basis for assigning reward for creative works. And then we take a little side note here into one of the cultural appropriation arguments I was making. And this is saying we can extend the idea of this Roman-style private property from individuals into cultures and treat these cultures as though they are some sort of like static static legal entity that has rights the same way that an individual has rights, or in the United States, a corporation has rights. But we have to deal with the fact that there is really no such thing as a culture in stasis or a culture in isolation. All cultures are gradients in time and space. All cultures are constantly shifting arrays of individuals, many of whom belong to many different cultures based upon specific contexts. And all cultures are constantly shifting and constantly in communication with other cultures. They define themselves and redefine themselves, both in opposition to and in collaboration with other cultures. There's no such thing as a lone culture that has no interaction with any other culture. This is a myth. The one specific argument of cultural appropriation that assumes that the only valid form of creativity that individuals can participate in is one which belongs to some kind of an imaginary, pure cultural lineage based on basically racial definitions that are turning cultural ideas into biological ideas. This is not something that exists. Even if this is how anyone ever wanted to practice artwork, practice their creative world, this is literally something which has never happened in human history. So this is sort of the empirical facts that we have to face, that these assumptions on how we want culture to behave, on how people want to treat culture, it just doesn't match up with how it actually works in the world. And then to go to number 2, which is where we are assuming that anyone who does creative work deserves both credit and to be paid money for our efforts. Let me just say, who the fuck thinks they get the right to decide who gets paid for what? Who deserves what? We have this kind of disturbing assumption that only people who do the right kind of hard work deserve to get rewarded with life-sustaining tokens, and that's how our societies get organized. But obviously, we can point out that there's a lot of empirical reasons that this is both bullshit in theory and bullshit in practice. Just to jump outside the art world for 1 second, it's a pretty clear fact, in about the last 100 years or so, some parts of the world has seen very highly decreased rates of death due to disease and environmental conditions. The blanket assumption is made that this is a direct result of Western-style doctors and hospitals springing up in various places. Facts seem to imply that a very significant proportion of the increase in public health, if not the vast majority of it, the credit is due to increased public sanitation, and not this bizarre scientific mystical cult that we call Western medicine. But then none of these societies where these things happen value their janitors as much as their doctors, either in social credit or in monetary reward. In fact, the exact opposite. Typically, janitors are treated as basically disgusting, gross-ass people who you should not talk to, look at, or touch. Probably because they're touching toilets, and toilets are gross. Whereas a doctor is the most respected, one of the most respected people in any sort of society, because they are so smart and wonderful, and they heal you with their hands and their wisdom. So this isn't really an argument that we're supposed to pay and respect janitors more than doctors. This is an argument that we shouldn't even be in this bullshit position where we think we can just kind of arbitrarily assign social and monetary value to humans at all. Just stop and think about it for a second. Everyone deserves to have access to money tickets, which will then enable them to have access to housing, food, healthcare, education, and basic amounts of free time to spend with their friends and family. Even people who don't seem to work hard at anything at any time whatsoever. This is just something that people should deserve. We construct a reality in which it seems like we have this, very restricted access to resources, and say, okay, motherfuckers, you all compete against each other in some Hunger Games bullshit, and whoever is the most ruthless gets the most. This is bullshit. This is completely a social construction. It has nothing to do with how much resources we actually have in the world. And yeah, if we were spending our time arguing about who gets credit for a glitch art remix of someone else's artwork, we have to at least admit we are implicitly saying that our priorities in distributing wealth are fundamentally supporting the ideas that some folks just don't deserve to be rewarded with life-sustaining tokens at all. To me, at this point, the real question is: do you care about more about making sure you personally get paid in competition with someone else, or do you care about trying to like change the way people think and maybe try to create a world where people don't have to have this kind of inane bullshit argument ever again? Because there's definitely like a very, very long way to go until we are like even near there. But there's literally no chance of even starting down that path if people are going to be fucking arguing about like who gets the right to get paid more for making something. It really all comes down to values versus value. We think these are kind of the same thing, but they really aren't. Values are what we as individuals and together as cultures prioritize enough to act upon in order to like make our intentions into manifested realities. Value is a number we assign to objects and services that makes it convenient for people to just throw money at things to solve their problems. If people decide to value private property and selectively rewarding some particular perception of hard work, we have to accept that the logical conclusions of holding these values are going to poison our creative artworks, if not many, 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 many other aspects of our lives. These are choices that we are making. Values inform our choices, but our choices can also fold back and inform our values. And it's probably a pretty good idea to work towards being in better positions to making informed choices about holding values that actually enhance our creative processes, and also by extent most other aspects of our lives as well, instead of maintaining values that don't just work against creative communities and how creativity actually functions in the world, but are actively working against the basic existence of human communities in general. To go back to that quote that we opened up with near the beginning of this talk, no man earns punishment, no man earns reward. Free your mind of the idea of deserving, the idea of earning, and you will begin to be able to think. So this quote comes from a very deeply ambivalent utopian science fiction book by Ursula K. Le Guin, where they sort of use their like Hainish worlds, like a space opera scenario, to explore ideas of like what an anarchist planet would be like, what a very capitalist planet would be like. Well, there was the anarchist moon, and then there was the capitalist/communist planet where there was a Cold War going on there. And, you know, it would be easy to read that book and say, oh my God, the anarchists are great, and these capitalists and communists are such trash people. But that's not actually how the book works. Like, it's very deeply ambivalent. There's not really any sort of, like, amazing conclusions they have about, like, what system works the best, or, like, is there something which is really in line with human behavior at all. And I do want to, like, end on this note of ambivalence at the end of this talk. Because making informed choices about our values, trying to change our individual and cultural values, is not some sort of easy fix utopian bullshit nonsense where you just press a button and you're like, well, I love everyone now, so now we're in a better position to fix things. It's something which actually requires a significant amount of hard work, the kind of hard work that no one is ever really going to pay you a lot of money for. All I can really say is that, speaking as someone who personally has spent a lot of time and energy doing their best to live by these kind of values, where I try to value human communities over personally competing in order to like profit over other people. And I've been trying. I'm not saying I've succeeded. I've definitely failed in many different ways, and then I start over and I try to do something different, and just kind of like keep trying to like shift my trajectory to like make sure that my actions and my life are in concordance with the kind of values and priorities that I want to live with. All I can say is that living this way, my personal rewards feel to me like they're a hell of a lot better than like when I've been trying to compete with making more money than everyone else. The standard method of like getting by in this world. So that's really all I can say as like an ending here. And I think we're going to just call that the end of this talk. All right. As always, have fun.